Okay then, we will start. It's right on close to 10:30. Thank you for coming out today to the Walkway. I'm John Hall, for those who don't know me, the project manager here at the Walkway, and I see some faces that have been here before, and some new people, and some those who have found our talks through the website and Eventbrite. So welcome. First of all, we'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples, in particular the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, because the grounds of the Walkway are situated where their lands. And we obviously acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So today our author and speaker, obviously as you realise, Colin Burgess. Colin is the author of more than 40 published books on the subjects of human space exploration and Australian military history. I don't think you can get a wider variation there. His military history books have covered topics including the Australian Bandbusters crew, Australian diggers in coal pits, and Australia's escape stories in World War I and II. In his working career, he was a cabin crew member of Qantas Airways for 30 years, before leaving to concentrate on his writing in 2002. And for the past 22 years, he's also been the sole series editor for an award-winning collection of books on the history of space exploration for the University of Nebraska Press in the US, now totaling 25 volumes. Busy boy. Colin and his wife Pat, who is also here today, live in Sydney's southern suburbs, and I'm pleased that Colin will return to the Walkway in June next year to talk about two more Australian nurses, Vera Tawney and Margaret Anderson. They were also involved in the evacuation of Singapore in 1942. However, and at the end of the talk, I'll give you a preview of I've got ahead of myself and I've organised the speakers for next year. I'll give you a preview of our speakers next year. Anyway, meantime, please welcome Colin to speak about two more amazing women.
Thank you for turning up today. Very nice to see all of you here. We've already had conversations with several of you. This is an extraordinary story, as it says there. It's also a story of courage, resilience, and defiance, compassion, selfless friendship under duress. It's difficult to imagine what these women went through as prisoners of the Japanese for 3.5 years on Sumatra. But anyway, the story begins with Sister Betty Jeffrey. Who recalls White Coolies and the stories of Sister Betty Jeffrey and Vivian Bullwinkle and the other nurses? When I was 8 years old, my family and I used to sit around the radio every Saturday night, as well as every other night. I mean, you listen to Jack Davey and Bob Dyer and all of that. But Saturday night was something special because at 9:30 there was a series on called White Coolies. So we'd sit there and every half hour we'd be entranced by this story. Went for 52 weeks. And the amazing thing is, in this modern day of technology, if you go to YouTube and type in White Coolies, you can listen to every one of those 52 episodes. It's extraordinary. An extraordinary story. So here's the ad. 9 o'clock, White Coolies, 2GB. And there's a snippet out of the paper there showing a rehearsal. And the lady there, sitting down, is Betty Jeffrey. And can you guess who this person is here? Maybe not. It's a very bad photograph and it's very old, but that's Ruth Cracknell. She played the role of Betty Jeffrey. And there's Betty Jeffrey listening to her story being told. Betty's book White Coolies was first published in 1954 and became an instant bestseller. It was based on her wartime diaries. Now, she kept those diaries throughout her 3.5 years of imprisonment by the Japanese. And the thing is that if she'd been caught with those diaries or writing the diaries, she could have been killed. She had to keep them hidden throughout all of her captivity. She'd hide it in pillowcases, broken jars, bottles, anything. But we'll come back to that a little later on, because this tells you a little bit about Betty Jeffrey. She was born in Newtown in Tasmania on the 14th of May 1908. Now, her father worked for what was called the GPO, the post office, and he was an administrator, so he moved around Australia quite a bit. So they eventually settled in Melbourne, well, there's Betty. She's in Warwick Girls' School in Melbourne in 1923. Now, here's a little quiz for you to keep you awake. Betty was always very properly and privily dressed. She wouldn't underdress, she always dressed to the hilt. So have a look at these girls here and see if you can spot Betty. Now, she's one of two, I think you'd find. The tie. And that's Betty sitting in the front. At school, she was a champion athlete, particularly in swimming. She loved the sport of swimming, and it is said that if she persevered, she might have even gone to the Olympic Games, certainly the Commonwealth Games. But she was widespread in her interest in sport, and eventually, after she graduated from high school, she went into sports administration at the school. She became what was called the sports mistress back in those days. But she always had thoughts of becoming a nurse. She had nurses in her relatives, she had friends who were nurses. She met a woman on a ship coming down from Brisbane to Melbourne who was a nurse, and they became lifelong friends. So eventually Betty joined the Australian Army Nursing Service and was assigned to the 2nd 10th Army General Hospital. Now, this is pre-war. This is pre-Japanese war. And these women were actually sent to Malaya to study things like tropical diseases and injuries suffered in tropical areas in case war did eventuate. To them, it was a bit of a holiday. There's 4 of the nurses. They're going across to New Zealand, to Malaya, on the HMAT, the hospital ship Zealandia. Betty's not amongst these ones, but she just turned 33 years of age. Now, when they got to Malaya, yes, they were treating a lot of people who were suffering from tropical injuries and diseases. But as you can see by the smiles on their faces, it wasn't anything to be taken too seriously. Yes, they had war drills, they had to wear helmets, they had to carry respirators or gas masks with them at all times. But they used to slip into Singapore and Kuala Lumpur and do shopping. It was all good fun. But then, on the 7th of December, I should say, in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Within hours, literally hours, they landed on the coast of Thailand and Malaya, and they started moving down the Malayan Peninsula. A lot of them were walking. They also had bicycles. They bring bicycles with them in order to move rapidly. And so they'd sweep down the Malayan Peninsula. And the nurses, you can see them down there in the hospital in Malaya, writing letters home. They knew that things were getting worse, and they were treating people now with injuries. Eventually, the authorities, the British and Australian authorities, decided that with the rapid advance of the Japanese down the Malayan Peninsula, that they had to get the nurses out. They had to get them to Singapore. There was a precedent which alarmed them. The Japanese had swept into Hong Kong, and on Christmas Day, some of their troops, without any accountability whatsoever, had raided a hospital, they'd violated nurses, they'd beheaded a lot of people, they bayoneted a lot of people. So in order to protect the Australian nurses, they decided to move them down to Singapore. The problem was that the Japanese advance was very swift. They kept hearing the bombing, everything going on around them. Singapore was about to fall. Things were getting critical. It was decided they had to get the nurses out and back to Australia. They started organising ships. They organised 3 ships. This is what was going on in Singapore. Death, destruction, carnage, widespread murder and fires, the oil fires around the walls. It was a critical situation. So days were important in getting these nurses out. In fact, hours. They eventually came up with 3 ships. There was the Wasui, a very small ship. So only 6 of the nurses out of the 165 that were held in Singapore got on the ship, along with 200 wounded. That was the whole objective. To send some nurses with these wounded from the hospital they were attending and get them back to Australia. So the Wasui sailed, made it back to Australia. The second ship was called the Empire Star, a much larger ship. And as John mentioned, my next book is about 2 of the nurses who served on that. And in great gallantry, they looked after the people on board. And in fact, one of them wore the George Cross, the other one was awarded the MBE. The third ship was called the Vina Brook. It was a luxury ship. It used to go up and down the coast. They would normally have around about 12 people on board travelling in luxury. But it was requisitioned, and instead of having 12 people on board plus crew, it now had nearly 200. Nurses, civilians, wounded, everybody desperate to get out of Singapore. Because the harbour by now was being bombed, ships were being sunk. It was a critical situation. So the Vina Brook sailed out of Singapore, made its way down through the islands, always under the watchful eye of Japanese pilots. And the pilots were strafing other ships, sinking other ships. In fact, on one day, they sank around about 43 ships. The Vina Brook came down and it made it to here, off the coast of Bangor Island. And there, the final bombing took place. The ship was sunk. One of the bombs from the plane actually went down the funnel and blew the engine room up. It took 3 minutes for the Vina Brook to sink. Now, in preparation for this, the matron on board had instructed her nurses in Singapore, and there were 65 of them on board this ship. She said, if anything happens to this ship, you have to look after the people on board first before you do anything, before you evacuate. And they did, as much as they could within those 3 minutes. But she also warned them. The life jackets they wore had a wooden strut across here. And she said, if you have to jump off the ship, for heaven's sake, put your hands there. Do not just jump in, because that will come up and break your neck. And we think that may have happened. But anyway, most of the people got off. 12 of the nurses were never seen again. They don't know whether they died on the ship or drowned or were sucked under when the ship went down. This is the sort of scene, as imagined, when the Vina Brook was sinking. There were wooden rafts about 2 metres square. There were wooden balustrades, everything they could find to float. But they were in the middle of oil-slicked waters. There were bodies floating everywhere. There were dead fish and sharks. It was an horrendous scene. Only a few people could get on the rafts, but the rafts also had ropes, and people could hang on to the ropes. And this is from the movie Paradise Road. It comes up on television all the time, on SBS mostly, with Glenn Close and other well-known people. But this shows the sinking of the Vina Brook and the nurses scrambling to safety. The water certainly wasn't as blue as that. It was black with oil, some of it burning. And there were bodies floating everywhere, children, adults. Now we take up the story of Betty Jeffrey. She escaped from the Vinyl Brook. She made sure that anybody within her range was safe before she evacuated. The way she evacuated, she saw a rope. She grabbed hold of the rope and slid down into the water. Took all the skin off both her hands. She could see the bones in her hands. She made it into the water, and she made it to one of the rafts with the ropes, and she was hanging onto the rope. And alongside her was Ione Harper from Western Australia, another nurse. The whole idea of the rafts and what was going to happen next was that they were seeking Banker Island. They could see it in the distance. And they were heading that way. The problem was the currents kept swerving the rafts back out again. The currents were that strong, so it wasn't an easy task. In fact, one raft full of nurses was swept away and never seen again. So Betty and Iona, because they were both good swimmers, eventually they could see that it was pointless staying with the raft. They had to try and get to land. So they started swimming, and Betty, as I said, was a very strong swimmer. They finally made it to land, but well away from this beach, which we'll feature very shortly, they actually ended up in swamps, mangrove swamps. It was a terrible place to land. They were barefoot, in rags, and trying to make their way through these mangrove swamps. They'd been in the water for nearly 3 days by the time they landed, and as they made their way through the jungles here, they started becoming delusional. They'd been through so much. They were encountering crocodiles, sea snakes, everything in the water there. And you can imagine what it's like walking through mangroves with bare feet. Ratchy Beach. This was the beach everyone was heading for, because those people who'd made it to shore from other ships, mostly, had set a bonfire, saying, "We're here, come this way," which they did. 21 of the nurses landed on Ratchy Beach. 22 landed on Ratchy Beach. And it's a serene, beautiful looking place. As soon as they had landed, the nurses started tending all of the injured and wounded and the ill, the people who were swept up. And there was around about 80 people, apart from the nurses, on Ratchy Beach, men, women and children. Most of the men were servicemen from other ships. Now, the story behind this picture is that the nurses landed on Ratchy Beach, in Banker Island. They started tending the wounded. After 2 days, the chief matron, Matron Drummond, said, "We have to get these injured people to hospital." They knew the Japanese had recently taken over the island, and they thought, surely the Japanese will see that these are wounded and they would look after them. So after 2 days, they decided to send a small deputation of men into a village to try and get some Japanese people with stretchers and first aid to come to the beach and remove these people to hospital. A few hours after they'd gone, a couple of the civilian women thought it might be a good idea if they and the children followed the men and went into town rather than staying on the beach, which they did. So leaving behind 22 nurses and around about 80 mostly critically injured people laying on the beach, service people. As the women and children marched along, they actually encountered a party coming back. The men leading some Japanese, armed with rifles, and a couple with machine guns. They didn't think too much of it. The women and children just kept going, fortunately. Nothing happened to them. The soldiers came down to the beach. The head nurse, Matron Drummond, said, "We're nurses, we're civilians. These people are injured, they need assistance." The Japanese action was to take up around half of the men, made them stand up, made them walk around the peninsula, out of sight. Next thing there were gunshots and screams. After a while they came back, rounded up the next squad, everybody else that was left on the beach. It took them around the peninsula, more screams, more cries, and then they came back wiping their bayonets off with blood. That left the 22 nurses. The Japanese commander ordered the nurses to face the water and to walk into the surf. They did, and then they opened fire. They shot them in the back. Matron Drummond was the first to die. She'd actually walked into the water saying, "Chin up, girls, I'm proud of you, I love you all." They were her last words. They shot her in the back and then opened fire on the rest of the nurses. The lady represented here is Vivian Bullwinkle, the closest lady there. She was shot in the back, and as you can see in the picture here, the bullet came actually out the front. It passed right through her body, fortunately didn't hit any major things, but she fell in the water nevertheless, and then decided she had to pretend to be dead, because they were going around shooting anybody they thought was still alive and bayoneting them. She had to restrain herself. She wasn't only breathing in water, she was breathing in the blood of her colleagues. But eventually, she decided to sneak a look and saw that the Japanese had gone. All that was left were the bodies floating around her. She was injured, she was quite badly injured, but she dragged herself up to the beach and managed to get behind some shrubs and hide. The Japanese did actually walk back again, but they didn't see her, and then they marched back off again. She spent 2 days unconscious. And finally, she made her way to a freshwater spring that was nearby. She knew that it was there because they discovered it when they first landed on the beach. She made her way there, and as she drank, she heard a voice. "Was that your sister?" And it was a British serviceman, Kingsley, who'd been badly wounded. All that Vivian could think about were the other nurses, the 21 nurses who died. And the lady at the top left-hand corner is Matron Drummond, that brave lady. So 21 nurses massacred on this beach on Banker Island, Raji Beach. So Kingsley was badly wounded. He'd been one of those taken around the corner. He'd been shot. He'd been bayoneted. In fact, his arm was almost hanging off, his left arm. Vivian started looking after him. After a couple of days, she decided that she had to get some food into him and herself. So she made her way to a village nearby and asked if she could have some food. The head man was very reluctant. He said, "Can't help you, lady. If we help you, the Japanese find out, it won't go well." So she turned around discouraged and started walking back, but then the bushes parted and a couple of the women from the village passed over banana leaves with food and fish in it. It took several days before Vivian finally said, "We have to do something. He's critically wounded." He was actually dying. But she said, "I think I have to surrender both of us to the Japanese." She knew what had happened to her colleagues. She knew that she could face the same fate, but she wanted to get this man to safety rather than laying in the jungle begging for food. So they did. It took a long time, but she managed to get him into the village, and they waited there for a Japanese patrol to come, and eventually they did, and they took her and Kingsley to this little town of Muntok. They were interrogated there and then placed in the jail. Now the good thing about the jail was that all of her nursing colleagues that survived, that landed elsewhere, were in the jail. There were 34 of them in the jail. And of course when she walked through the gates, they all rushed up. "Bully, it's you, where are you? How have you been? What happened? Where's everybody else?" And she had to take them aside secretly and say what had happened to the rest of the nurses. She also warned them, "Please do not say anything. If the Japanese find out I was a witness to what happened, I won't last more than a few seconds." They kept a secret throughout the war for 3.5 years. There's Muntok Jail, as it was back then. But eventually, once they'd all been gathered up, along with a lot of civilian women and children and men, the men were eventually marched off to their own prison camps. The women were allocated to camps that had been set up. Very rough camps. It was only the women and children and the nurses, as I say, the men were elsewhere. So the 32 nurses out of the original 65 were consigned to these camps. They were filthy, pestilential places. They were disgusting. Top left photograph is a camp hospital. No facilities, no medicines, no drugs, no nothing. Just bare boards on which people lay. When it rained, the rain came through the attic roof and would just fall on the ground, and the ground was mud, so you can imagine what the conditions were like in the hospital. There was hardly any water available. They pretty much had half a cup full to drink and about half a bucket full to wash. There was no privacy. They had to wash basically in public with the Japanese soldiers looking on. And even worse, to go to the toilet, there was a trench dug behind the huts, and the women had to go there, swap toilet. Once again, with the Japanese guards walking past all the time, laughing. If a Japanese dignitary or even a guard walked past, they had to bow low. If they did, they were beaten. In the extreme, they were made to stand in the sun, in the middle of the compound for 2 days, with no food, no water, no hat, no protection from the beating sun. And you can imagine what the sun was like in Sumatra at midday. This is one of the huts, as drawn by a civilian internee called Margaret Trylberg. And Margaret is an incredible woman, not only a wonderful artist, but after 2 years, more than 2 years in imprisonment in different prison camps with the civilian women and the nurses, she decided that everyone had been driven mad. They had to do something to raise their spirits. Now, she was classically trained in music. She loved the classics, and she'd been well trained in it, and she also had a friend, Nora Chambers, who was a similar aficionado of classical music. What they decided to do was sit down and write out classical scores on whatever paper they could find and form an orchestra. Now, when I say orchestra, the Japanese certainly wouldn't allow musical instruments into the camp. So she devised what was called a vocal orchestra. She would select women as a part of the orchestra. One woman would be a violin, next person would be the cello, Next person, she had a strident voice, she did a trumpet. And she eventually formed this FoK orchestra, an Easter training secret in the Dutch kitchen. Down the bottom, that drawing was actually drawn by Betty Jeffrey. You can see how skinny she was at this stage. That shows how they used to train the vocal orchestra in the kitchen. Now, when Margaret and Nora thought that the orchestra was ready, they very bravely one day walked out into the compound, sat themselves down on little bits of log, and they started singing. They started singing Dvorak's New World Ballado from Dvorak's New World Symphony. Within a couple of minutes, a Japanese guard rushed up. Oh, yeah! Then he stopped. And he lowered his rifle and just started listening. He was joined by a couple of other guards. They allowed it to finish. And in fact, beyond that, they were allowed to have 2 more of these concerts with different pieces, all written on paper from memory from these 2 women. That's all they had, was their memory. Now, once again, I turn to the movie Paradise Road, which actually I watched a bit of the other night. It does turn up all the time. Kate Blanchett, Glenn Close. And this is the vocal orchestra. Now, honestly, I take exception to this photograph because look at them. White shirts, nicely pressed, Sunday best. These women were in rags. After 2.5 years of imprisonment, they didn't have anything decent to dress in. So unfortunately, this photograph doesn't represent the way things really were. But what they had was the music and the spirit. And it elevated the spirits of everybody in the camp. Because most people back then were seriously ill with beriberi, other tropical diseases, untreated. There was no medicine, there was nothing. All they could do was hope that one day they'd be set free. The drawing on the left is actually from Betty Jeffrey's diary. That was her piece. She was part of the orchestra. And the other pictures here are some of the camp scenes that she drew during her imprisonment. Betty was very seriously ill herself. At one stage, she was in hospital. The hospital being what it was, basically bunks. They all had to make wills. And in fact, this is Betty's will. I, Agnes Betty Jeffrey, in the event of my death, while interned by Japanese authorities, desire all my possessions to be given to Sister Iole Harper, and I desire that the British Commandant carry out this request, signed by Betty Jeffrey and witnessed by 3 of her fellow nurses. On the left is actually the pencil that she used to write in her diaries. And you can see the word Jeff on it, that's how she was known in the camp. Now one day, she was in hospital in a very, very bad way. And she looked up and one of the other friendly nurses was standing at the foot of the bed. And Betty looked and she said, "I know why you're here, but I'm not dying today." Because what they used to do was they'd keep an eye on the nurses, and when they died, or any other woman died, they'd put them into a very rough coffin, basically like a banana box. And they would carry them up the hill to a small cemetery, and they'd lay them to rest there. They'd put a marker on their names. But Betty decided that wasn't going to be her this day, and it wasn't. She managed to survive. Now, I'm trying to cover 3.5 years here, but let's get to the end of it. In August of 1945, the Japanese commandant had a table dragged out into the compound. He got 2 of his soldiers to stand him up on the table, and he had an announcement. He said, through a translator, the war is over. Now, he didn't say who won, but his next statement was something quite incredible. He said, the war is over, now we can all be friends. It was hideous. After what they'd endured, starvation, complete lack of medicine or care, and in fact, of the 32 nurses held captive, only 24 would survive the brutality of the camps. 24 out of the original 65. As I said, 12 died on the ship, 21 were killed on Raji Beach, 8 died in the camps. Eventually, soon after the Japanese announcement, some troops, Dutch troops and Australian troops, managed to find the camp and told the women they were liberated, but they told them to wait until emergency rescue could be organised, evacuation. What they did was that they put on their very best uniform. Many of them have been captured in these uniforms, and they kept them aside for this day. So you can see a lot of them were in partial uniforms, but they wanted this to be a very special day, the Day of Liberation. So the 24 nurses were taken out to Laha Airport, and they kept watching the skies. And eventually DC-3 circled around and landed on this rough airstrip. People came off the plane, a pilot, a journalist, and a senior matron. And she walked over to the nurses and she said, "Thank God you're all alive. Where are the rest of you?" And then they had to tell her there was only 24. What she saw there was it, 24 out of 65. They were taken to Singapore on the aircraft, and placed in the hospital, where they received the best of care. You can look at some of the photographs, how skinny their arms were. They were going to be taken back to Australia, but they had to recuperate first. And you can see down the bottom left-hand side that while they're recuperating, and Vivian Bullwinkle is the one closest to me here, in the dressing gown. They put them on a ship and sent them back to Fremantle, first port of call in Australia, where they received a tumultuous welcome. They were given brand new uniforms. Eventually they dispersed all over Australia, went back to their families. And there's Benny in the middle, surrounded by her family, her parents, her sisters, and a brother-in-law at the back. They didn't know what had happened to these women. The first they knew was when they were told that they were coming home. The Japanese wouldn't let them. They let them write one letter home, but whether it actually reached there, nobody ever knows. And letters that they'd sent in the hopes of reaching their loved one never made it to them. Now, Betty was in hospital for about 2 years off and on. Like so many of her friends and colleagues, it took a long time to recover from the ordeal of being in these camps, the hunger, the deprivation, feedings, complete lack of compassion. But while she was in hospital, she had a little portable typewriter, and she decided she would type out her secret camp diaries. Now, I don't know who convinced her, but eventually Angus and Robertson's heard about this, and they suggested it be published. And it was. It became the immediate bestseller I mentioned before. And there's Betty with the very first copy of White Coolies, and looking over her shoulder, of course, is Vivian Bullwinkle. They were the greatest of friends. I was saying to somebody here earlier that Simon & Schuster are now looking at republishing White Coolies, but they've already said they can't use it under that name because it's not politically correct anymore. So we'd probably be publishing something like Sister Betty Jeffrey's War Diaries, as written by the author of White Coolies, right down the bottom. But it became an instant bestseller. Vivian Bullwinkle had to give evidence of the Japanese atrocities of the War Crimes Commission in Tokyo in 1947. She did, and a lot of punishment was handed out to a lot of the Japanese in charge of the camp. Some of the sentences were not as long as they should be because it was a time of reparation and let's try and ease things with the Japanese rather than punish them. The chap who had been in charge of the firing squad on Raji Beach was captured, held in a camp in a prison, but hung himself. They say that the soldiers in that squad were sent to New Guinea and none of them survived. So none of the people who committed that atrocity on Raji Beach were ever really punished. Now after the war, once Betty was well enough, she and Vivian got together. They wanted to recognise their fellow nurses who died, and they wanted to set up some sort of lasting memorial to them. Their idea was a centre that catered for the many and varied needs of the nursing profession. This could be trainee nurses, it could be nurses passing through Melbourne, anybody. It was a rest centre for nurses. It was also a place of education. They could study later on for scholarships. They set out driving around Victoria. Fortunately, the Ford Motor Company had donated them a car. They called in everywhere, raising money. They would talk about, they hadn't talking about the war, but they talked about it. They told of their experiences simply to raise enough money to buy this centre, and eventually they raised something like £125,000. Post-war, when money was tight, it was an amazing achievement. But they set up this Nurses Memorial Centre called Manola on St Kilda Road. A beautiful old building, and Betty was appointed the very first administrator of the building. When it was opened in 1950, she was there, and she wasn't standing on the glory at all. She was there handing out scones and cups of tea. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. Back then it was known as the Nurses Memorial Centre. It's now the Australian Nurses Memorial Centre in St Kilda, but it's not in that beautiful old building. That was pulled down. And it's now in a glass tower block on St Kilda Road. There's Betty with her little dog Robbie, when she was the administrator at the Nurses Memorial Centre. And here she is in 1987 in Government House, receiving her Order of Australia. Not necessarily for what had happened during the war, but for what she did after the war. She would march on Anzac Day, and the photograph over there, you can see the tall lady beside her on Betty's right is Vivian Bullwinkle, and the other lady is one of the Western Australian nurses who was also held prisoner. They would have reunions whenever they could organise them. Now this is Vivian Bullwinkle and Betty Jeffrey. You're wondering about the chap down the bottom with the beard? He was the pilot of the DC-3 that rescued them. They all became lifelong friends. They would have reunions whenever they could. Betty never married. She was never 100% fit for the rest of her life, but she decided to take up golf. And she joined the Huntingdale Golf Club, and that's her on the far left. The lady in the middle, very famous opera singer, Dame Joan Hammond, and a very famous woman golfer, Berta Cheney. Huntingdale recognised us through the Betty Jeffrey Trophy, and the lady down the bottom here is the lady who won it about 2 years ago. But again, here they are, all the women, at a reunion outside of the Nurses Memorial Centre. And that, there, it's still there. It still recognises the nurses from all wars. And there it is, as it is today, and the glass building behind. If you go a little further along there, that's where the Nurses Memorial Centre is today. Now, I do have copies of Sisters in Captivity here today. I've got another one of my books as well, but You might like to know that when I was sending this book out, I tried to contact a member of Betty Jeffrey's family. I struck her great niece, Emily Malone, she was a fantastic person. She loved her great-grandmother and couldn't do enough to assist her. She got the whole family together around a big table, and I put my recorder in the middle, and they all went one by one, their memories of Betty Jeffrey. And I pledged that 50% of the royalties would be going to the Australian Nurses Memorial Centre. Last year, I think it had been mentioned about $20,000, and that enabled them to award a couple of scholarships to trainee nurses. So Betty Jeffrey's legacy in that way continues. The Australian War Memorial last year, they erected a statue of Vivian Bullwinkle. It's probably about as high as its roof, I'd imagine, standing on that plinth. She was a remarkable woman, and it was high time that she was recognised as such. And I always end up with my personal thanks to Betty Jeffrey, because her life and her legacy continues to be an inspiration not only to me but so many other people. She passed away in 2000, just before the Sydney Olympics, and Vivian Bullwinkle had actually predeceased her by about 6 months. They both died in the year 2000. But a remarkable story of compassion and dedication. Women who, if they had found a small piece of food, they wouldn't eat it. They'd go to the hospital, they'd go to someone who was desperately needing it. They survived 3.5 years. It's absolutely amazing. Inspirational is the word. And I always thank Betty Jeffrey. I did write to her in 1979, I was telling someone, and she wrote back a beautiful letter. I told her I still had my yellow copy of White Coolidge. She said, yeah, I've got one too. So that is the story of Betty Jeffrey, the White Coolies, and the story of the terrible, terrible Banker Island massacre on Ratchy Beach. It's a story that is now being told. There's another book out called Sister Viv, which, once you've bought my book, I heartily recommend that you purchase that as well, because it's a wonderful, wonderful story of a truly incredible woman. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I will have books for sale. Unfortunately, I don't have a machine, so it's cash only. But I'll have just $20 each. That's half price. You're very privileged. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. I'll talk about the talks coming up a bit later. And we'll open it up for questions. I've got a couple of observations. First of all, the fact that the movies, the Paradise Road, even the name kind of conjures up not the grim reality of it. But I have a feeling that maybe now, if they made that type of movie, they would make it a bit more realistic. I don't think Hollywood can take the grim, awful reality of what they face, and maybe they thought maybe audiences wouldn't believe it or would be turned off by it.
Yeah, it's just too horrifying to contemplate. It was actually, the shooting on the beach was actually pretty much overlooked in the movie.
Yeah.
But I can see why they like to Hollywoodise everything. The things like calling it Paradise Road, that was actually a contradiction. They would be in such a squalor and that they would call it a road outside the hut, Paradise Road, just because it wasn't. But I think, when you look back to movies like A Town Like Alice and things like that, and they were pretty well as things were. But again, they can't show the absolute brutality. And these days, of course, we're very much aware of treading on people's sensibilities. You can't show Japanese massacring people anymore. And even though it's a reality, that just cannot be shown anymore. You look at some of the more recent movies, and yes, they really don't depict what happened. There was another movie about Ambon. A lot of Australians and Englishmen were murdered on the island of Ambon as well. Sandak and 1,600 men, servicemen, were killed, basically walking from one side of the island to the other. Only 6 survived, 6 Australians survived because they escaped. The sheer brutality of what went on just can't be depicted anymore. And, it's horrifying, but in books you can do this, although, please don't call them nips, please don't call them Japs. You have to go with the flow sometimes. But the truth is out there, and I think, I'm certainly trying to do my best to tell the truth in some of these remarkable stories about these incredible people.
I mean, in some way, we've kind of faced that here at the walkway where we commemorate the Kokoda campaign. And I know when you write something, if you quote a contemporary source, you've always got to say, the language he made is not the language. We are talking 80 odd years ago. But yes, but like the Betty Jeffrey story, and the Vivian Bullwinkle and the others, the Kokoda story is one of harsh, grim realities of primitive hand-to-hand fighting, which many people still find hard to believe.
Yeah.
But all you can do is to keep promoting, keep the understanding going.
That's
My other question, and I'll open it up, is did they know of the war's progress?
No,
At all?
No, they didn't.
Unlike other camps,
They
where
were-
word got in, but
In fact, they were fed misinformation. I recall there was laughter in the camp one day because the Japanese commandant said, "Our forces have swept into Sydney Harbour and we've captured Sydney. We have destroyed Sydney Harbour Bridge. We drove a boat, captured boat, and took out the centre pylon." And he goes, "There's no centre pylon." And that's just one of the lines that the Japanese were always going to win the war. They were winning the war, they were doing this, they were doing that. So they had to take all these things with a grain of salt. But anything, they had no radio, they had no communication whatsoever. So they didn't know the progress of the war. And in fact, when the Japanese commandant stood up and said the war is over, they didn't know who won. They assumed that the Allies had won, but there was just that thing, there was no communication. And the thing I didn't mention before was that when the camp was liberated, they opened up the warehouse. It was a big warehouse building. It was full of Red Cross parcels, food, everything, and it had all been rated. The Japanese had taken whatever they wanted out of it. There was another storage area, and they opened it up, and all the hospital equipment was in there. The medicines, the drugs, the bandages, everything that they could have used, that they were denied. Quinine. No, nothing. They were given nothing at all during those 3.5 years. It was all kept away from it. And that, when you think about it, you think about a massacre, you also think this is brutality that's extreme, that you do not even allow people to live when they're on deathbed.
so there were no new camp inmates coming in.
No.
That it was just that group.
Just
no one.
that group, and they were just slowly diminishing because they were dying. Women and children, men, the nurses. The men were in other camps. They, in fact, in one camp, they could actually see the men in the far distance, and they would sing to each other, particularly on Christmas Day. They sang across this kilometre distance a couple of Christmas carols to each other.
And there were no civilians.
Yes, there were.
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
A lot of civilians, a lot of Dutch women.
So the women and children that went first after and they said they saw the Japanese coming this way, and that party of women and children, they went on to other camps.
Yes, they did.
Right.
Probably presumably the same
Presumably.
camps as the nurses went to.
Yeah. So I've had my Curiosity sacred. Yes.
Did they in the camp have any contact with the native people outside?
They tried, but the people outside knew that it was dangerous for them to do anything for the women. Yes, some of them did smuggle food under the wire and things like that, but one was actually caught one time and executed. So there was minimal. They tried to do what they could, but it all had to be done very covertly. But they couldn't be seen to be helping because it meant death.
I came because I wanted to get a little bit more information about this, and I have now, but 1942 was very much in my mind. I had a mother who was a training sister, and she trained Sister Bullwinkle. So I know a lot about Sister Bullwinkle. And a lot of her friends, nursing friends, went overseas. And so we didn't hear much about those. We had a garage at home that had no car because my father didn't have a car and he couldn't drive, and all that sort of situation. And we had Sister Gardner, this 1938 Chev up on blocks there, which I used to enjoy driving, pretending to drive at that particular stage. And she came home, and I was sort of interested in where she was. I know she was in the north, and probably with that batch in Sumatra.
Yes,
that survived, I don't know.
They're actually
After the war she came back, and I can remember her as an old wizened lady. Well, for a 7-year-old, you only had to be 40 to do that, I suppose. But I don't know how true it was, but she came back to pick up the car and off. So she got out of it. Lots of the other friends Mum had through nursing never appeared again, so I presume they were killed, that sort of thing. But that's why I walked the track with the kids, because 1942 was very vivid in my mind. I had an uncle, Harry, that worked on the nets in Sydney Harbour, and he brought me back a piece of the Japanese mini sub. It's now in the museum at Canberra, because what do you do with it? Hunker metal, you know, that sort of thing, but it was a souvenir in those particular days. And